The fleet that beat the Spanish Armada was never paid. Within weeks of the victory, its sailors were dying of disease. In the ships off the Kent coast, the Lord Admiral of England was buying food for them out of his own pocket, and the crown that had just been saved could not find the money for their wages. This video is about how Elizabethan England paid for that war. Not the fireships and not the weather, but the accounts, what the crown's income actually was, how a country with almost no money assembled a fleet, who owned the ships, who took a cut of the profits, and what it cost the monarchy afterwards. The Armada is remembered as a naval story. It is a financing story with a battle in the middle of it. Start with the size of the English crown, because nothing else in this makes sense without it. Elizabeth I had been Queen of England since 5058. Her ordinary revenue, the money that came in year after year without asking anyone's permission, was in the region of £250,000 a year. That was rents from Crown land, the customs, and the profits of justice, and it was expected to cover the entire cost of governing the realm. Set that against the cost of a war, and the problem is obvious. A single season of naval campaigning against Spain could consume more than the crown's entire annual income, and the Armada year cost several times what a peaceful year did. There was no standing army, no permanent navy in the modern sense, and no mechanism for borrowing at scale. There was a queen with a rent roll. Raising more meant asking Parliament for a subsidy, and that was not a formality. A subsidy was a one-off grant, voted for a specific purpose, assessed by local gentlemen who consistently undervalued their neighbours, and it arrived late. Every request cost a crown political capital and invited demands in return. Elizabeth asked when she had to and hated doing it. So the English state did something that looks strange to modern eyes and was, at the time, entirely rational. It made war pay for itself. Rather than tax the country to fund a navy, the crown licensed private men to attack Spanish shipping, took a shareholder's cut of what they brought home, and treated the proceeds as revenue. And that is the question this episode turns on, so here it is now, rather than at the end. A state too poor to fund a fleet turned its foreign policy into an investment portfolio, with the sovereign as the largest single shareholder. It worked, in the sense that the Armada was beaten. It also meant that when victory came, there was nobody whose job it was to pay the crews. So, was that clever financing, or was it simply war financed by other people? Hold on to that, because everything that follows is evidence for one answer or the other. And it begins with the single most profitable voyage in English history. Francis Drake, a Devon seaman sailing under a private commission, left Plymouth in 1577 with 5 ships and orders that was deliberately vague about what he was allowed to do. He came back in 1580 with 1 ship, having gone round the world, and with a hold full of Spanish silver and gold taken off the Pacific coast of America, where no Englishman had been before, and where Spanish ships accordingly carried no guns. The prize that mattered was a treasure ship, the Spanish called by a nickname that will not survive translation into polite English, taken off Peru after a chase of several days. The figures reported for what Drake brought home vary, as they always do with treasure, but the serious estimates run to several £100,000. That is on the order of 2 years of the crown's entire ordinary income in one hold. To understand why that was possible, you have to understand what Spain had built. Silver from the mountain at Potosi and the mines of Mexico, moved by mule to the Pacific and Caribbean coasts, was gathered into ports and then crossed the Atlantic in convoy under escort. The convoy system was formidable, and it mostly worked, but it protected the Atlantic crossing because that was where the danger had always been. On the Pacific side, there had never been any danger, so there were no guns. Spanish ships carried treasure up and down the coast of Peru with the confidence of a company moving cash inside its own building. Drake did not defeat a defended system. He walked in through the one door nobody had thought to lock, which is why the return on that voyage was of an order no ordinary trade could produce. The investors in that voyage did extremely well, and the return quoted at the time was in the thousands of %. But the point for this story is who the investors were. Elizabeth was one of them, discreetly, and her share of the proceeds is generally reckoned to have exceeded the whole ordinary revenue of the crown for a year. Which is why what happened next was not a coronation of a hero, but the settling of an account. The Queen came aboard at Deptford, Drake was knighted on his own deck, and a very large quantity of treasure went into the Tower. Spain demanded restitution. Elizabeth declined, on the elegant ground that Spain had no right to exclude English ships from oceans it did not own. Now look at the instrument that made this repeatable, because a single lucky voyage is not a policy. The legal device was the letter of Marque, a commission issued by the Crown authorizing a private ship to take the vessels and goods of a named enemy and to bring the prize into an English port to be judged. Read what that document actually does, and you can see the whole system in it. It converts an act of robbery into a legal proceeding. The prize is brought in, valued, and condemned by a court. The Crown takes its share, the customs take theirs, the owners and investors take theirs, and the crew take theirs. Everybody involved has a documented, enforceable claim on the proceeds of an act of violence. The economics of that are remarkable, and they explain why England fought the way it did for 20 years. The Crown supplied no capital. It supplied permission, a court to enforce the division, and a flag. The ships, the guns, the powder, the food, and the wages were all found by private investors who accepted the risk of total loss in exchange for a share of an uncertain prize. And the reason the Crown did not simply tax instead is worth knowing, because the answer is not that England was poor. A Tudor subsidy was assessed locally by commissioners drawn from the same gentry who were being taxed, on valuations that had been allowed to fossilize decades earlier. A man worth thousands was routinely assessed at a fraction of it, and everyone knew. The tax base was not small, the measurement of it was politely fictional. The other instruments were worse. The Crown could demand a forced loan, which meant writing to wealthy subjects under the Privy Seal and requiring them to lend, with repayment at the sovereign's convenience. It could sell monopoly patents, granting one man the exclusive right to import or make some commodity in exchange for cash now. Both raised money and both bought resentment, and the monopolies in particular produced a parliamentary row before the reign was over. Against those alternatives, a letter of Marque is an extraordinarily attractive document. It costs the Crown nothing, it annoys nobody who matters in England, it requires no assessment and no collection, and it produces revenue from the assets of a foreign king. The system also leaked in the way any system leaks when the people doing the valuing are the people being paid. Prizes were undervalued. Cargo went over the side into small boats before the ship reached the court. Crews helped themselves on the voyage home, which was traditional and expected, and the crown share was computed on whatever survived to be counted. The court records show the arguments, and the crown was frequently the party that lost them. Who were those investors? London merchants, West Country ship owners, courtiers with cash, and syndicates that spread a stake across several voyages to smooth the risk, which is the same instinct that produced marine insurance in the same city in the same decades. Privateering in the Elizabethan War was not a fringe activity of desperate men. It was a recognized, respectable, and heavily subscribed asset class. At its height, the value of prizes brought into English ports during the war ran to something in the order of £100,000 to £200,000 a year. Hold that beside the Crown's ordinary revenue of about £250,000, and you can see what had happened. A parallel privately funded war economy had grown to roughly the same size as the government. And there is a specific commercial event that turned a great many respectable merchants into privateers in a single season. In 1585, Spain seized English ships and cargoes lying in Spanish ports, in what was in effect a mass confiscation of trading assets. Men who had been perfectly happy selling cloth and buying wine suddenly had a loss on their books and no legal remedy. The Crown's response was to issue commissions permitting them to recover the value by taking Spanish property at sea. That is an extraordinarily neat piece of policy, and it did three things at once. It compensated the injured merchants at no cost to the exchequer, it converted their capital and their ships into an instrument of war, and it made the war popular with exactly the class whose money the Crown could not otherwise reach. The Crown went further than licensing, though, and this is the part that turns a tax policy into an investment strategy. For the larger expeditions, Elizabeth put in ships and money and took shares like any other subscriber. The voyage that Drake took to the West Indies in 1585 was organized as a joint stock venture, with the Queen as the largest single participant. Think about what that means constitutionally, because it is genuinely odd. The sovereign was not funding a national fleet out of taxation. She was buying equity in an armed commercial venture whose business was attacking the shipping of another kingdom alongside private men who expected a dividend. War was not a charge on the state. It was a line in a portfolio. The 1585 voyage sacked Santo Domingo and Cartagena and came home with far less than the investors had hoped, and by some accounts they did not recover their stake. That matters. A privateering war is only stable while it is profitable, and the returns were wildly uneven. Investors could not be compelled to subscribe to the next one, and if the last voyage lost money, the next one was harder to fund. Then came Cadiz in 1587, and it is the best single illustration of the whole system working exactly as designed. Drake sailed with a mixed royal and private squadron, entered the harbor at Cadiz, and destroyed a large quantity of shipping and stores being gathered for the invasion of England. The most consequential thing he destroyed was barrel staves, seasoned wood for casks stockpiled in southern Spain for the Armada's provisions. Casks made from green timber leak, and the food and water inside them spoils, and the Armada that sailed the following year sailed with defective barrels and rotten provisions. A raid on a timber yard did more damage than most battles. And here is the part that tells you what kind of war this was. On the way home from that raid, Drake took a Portuguese carrack coming back from the East Indies, the San Felipe, and her cargo was valued at something in the region of £114,000. The expedition that delayed the Spanish invasion by a year also turned a profit for its shareholders. Now the fleet itself, because the ownership of it is the fact most people get wrong. The English Navy that faced the Armada in 1588 numbered something close to 200 vessels, and only about 34 of them belonged to the Queen. The rest were armed merchantmen and private ships, contributed or hired, including a substantial squadron found by the City of London. The City of London's part in that is worth stating precisely because it is the clearest case of the private sector outbidding the request. The Crown asked the city for a number of ships and men, and the city is generally said to have provided about double what was asked. That is not patriotic excess for its own sake. London's wealth was seaborne, and a Spanish army in England was an existential risk to every merchant house in the city. That is a fleet that is roughly 4/5 private property. The Crown owned the largest and best designed fighting ships, and those ships did the serious work. But the mass of the fleet, the men who crewed it, and a great deal of the powder and shot came from owners who expected either payment or plunder, and in many cases got neither. The royal ships themselves were the one part of this the Crown had genuinely invested in, and the man responsible is worth naming. John Hawkins, the Treasurer of the Navy, had spent a decade rebuilding the fighting fleet around a new design. Lower, longer, faster ships carrying heavier guns, built to fight at a distance rather than to grapple and board. Hawkins was also accused, repeatedly and by serious people, of enriching himself in the process. He held contracts, he cut costs, and his enemies said the savings went into his own pocket. The accusations were investigated and never conclusively proved, and the ships he built were the best in Europe. It is an early and very pure example of a defense procurement argument, and it has never been fully settled. The campaign of 1588 itself can be told quickly because this is not a battle channel. The Armada came up the channel in the Crescent, could not be broken by gunfire, anchored off Calais, was scattered by fireships, was mauled off Grave lines, and was then driven north and west by weather that destroyed far more of it than the English guns did. The cost is worth stating because it is the number that breaks the Crown. Expenditure in the Armada year is generally put at something in the region of £400,000 against an ordinary revenue of about £250,000. In other words, the emergency cost the better part of 2 years of income in 1 year, and the subsidy voted to cover it was assessed and collected on the usual leisurely timetable, which is to say, afterwards. What is worth saying about the fighting is the ammunition. English ships fired off their shot faster than it could be replaced, and the fleet spent part of the crisis waiting on powder and ball that had to be found and paid for. A navy funded by prizes has no logistics establishment, because logistics is a fixed cost, and the whole model was built to avoid fixed costs. One thing before we go on: if you subscribe, it genuinely helps this channel keep going, and there is a new piece of British financial history every single day. And leave a comment while you are here. It matters more than you would think. Which brings us to what happened to the men, and it is the moral center of this episode. The English fleet came back from the pursuit and anchored in the Downs and off Margate with thousands of men aboard, many of them sick. Typhus and dysentery went through the crews. Men who had fought the Armada died in harbour, in sight of England, in the ships. They had not been paid, and the reason was structural rather than callous. There was no fund for it. The Crown's money had gone on victualling and munitions during the crisis. The subsidy had not arrived, and the ships were full of men whose wages were a liability nobody had provided for. The victory had come with no payroll attached to it. Lord Howard of Effingham, the Lord Admiral, wrote about it in the weeks after the battle to William Cecil, Lord Burghley, who was Elizabeth's Lord Treasurer and had run her finances for 30 years, and the letters are the most uncomfortable documents of the whole affair. He described men sickening and dying, said it was too pitiful to have them starve after such a service, and spent his own money and Hawkins's on food and relief while he waited for London to act. Consider the position Howard was in. He had just commanded the defense of the kingdom. He was a peer of the realm and cousin to the Queen. And his practical problem in September 1588 was finding cash for bread, for men who had been discharged with wages outstanding because the machinery of the state had no line for it. That is what a privateering war does at the end. When there is a prize, everybody has a documented claim and the money divides itself. When there is no prize, and 1588 produced very little because the Armada carried soldiers rather than treasure, there is no pot, and a wage claim against a crown with no cash is a wage claim against nothing. And there is a postscript to the wages that is the single most revealing detail in this whole story. Within a couple of years, a fund was established to relieve seamen who had been wounded or disabled in the service, known afterwards as the Chatham Chest, and it is usually credited to Hawkins and Drake. It was a genuine piece of welfare provision and one of the earliest anywhere. It was funded by a deduction from the wages of serving seamen, not from the prize fund, not from the customs, not from the Crown's ordinary revenue. The men who had been left unpaid after the Armada were the people who paid for the relief of the men who had been maimed alongside them. Out of the wages they did eventually receive. That is the logic of the whole arrangement in a single institution. Every cost that could be pushed down the chain was pushed down the chain, and the bottom of the chain was the crew. It is not that anybody was indifferent to them. Howard plainly was not. It is that the financing model had no place in it where their claim could sit. The model then broke, and it broke quickly. In 58-9, a large expedition went to Portugal under Drake and Norris, organized again as a joint stock venture with the Queen, a major subscriber, intended to raise Portugal against Spain and to take the treasure fleet. It failed on every objective, lost a great many men to disease, and lost its investors their money. After that, Elizabeth would not commit royal ships and royal money to shareholder expeditions on the same terms again. The reason is simple, and it is the reason the model was always fragile. An investor who loses his stake declines to subscribe next time. A privateering war can only be waged while it looks profitable, and after 1589 it did not. So how did England pay for the remaining 15 years of the war? Partly by subsidies, granted more often and more grudgingly, and partly by the only other asset the Crown had: it sold land. Over the course of the war, Elizabeth disposed of Crown estates on a very large scale, running to hundreds of thousands of pounds, and the estimates for the full period reached something like 800,000. Understand what that transaction is. Crown land was the permanent income of the monarchy, the rent roll that made the sovereign independent of Parliament. Selling it converted a stream of future revenue into a lump of present cash. It is the 16th century equivalent of a household selling the shop to pay this month's bills, and every acre sold made the next war harder to fund without asking. And it matters enormously who bought it. Crown land sold in the 1590s went to the people with cash, London merchants, lawyers, and above all, the rising county gentry. Every sale moved a piece of the monarchy's permanent income into the hands of a class that sat in the House of Commons, and it did so at exactly the moment that House was learning how much leverage it had over a sovereign who could not fight without a subsidy. Elizabeth died in 1603, leaving a debt of a few £100,000, which, by later standards, is trivial. But the balance sheet behind that modest figure is the real legacy, a monarchy that had spent nearly 20 years fighting a great power without a tax system capable of paying for it, and had covered the difference by licensing plunder and selling its own capital. That is why the Armada belongs in a series about money as much as one about ships. The Stuart quarrels over ship money, forced loans, and prerogative taxation that followed are the direct consequence of this position. The Crown had less land, no borrowing machinery, and a parliament that had learned that the sovereign could not fight without it. The answer eventually arrived a century later in a form nobody in 1588 could have imagined: a permanent national debt, a central bank to manage it, and taxation to service it, so that a state could borrow against its future revenue instead of selling its assets. That story is its own episode on this channel. What matters here is what the country did before that existed. So go back to the question, now that the accounts are on the table. England beat the greatest fleet in Europe with a navy that was mostly not the Crown's, funded by investors expecting a dividend, and the men who won it were left dying unpaid in their own ships while their admiral bought their bread. Clever financing, or war financed by other people. The strongest defense is simply that it worked and that no alternative existed. There was no instrument in 1588 for borrowing what a war costs, and the Queen, who taxed hard enough to pay for a fleet outright, would have faced a parliament with an entirely different set of demands. She used what she had, which was permission, a court, and a flag, and she got a victory out of it. But notice who carried the risk in that arrangement. The investors carried it and were compensated in prizes. The Crown carried almost none and took a share of the upside. And the seamen carried the part nobody had priced. They fought on the promise of wages from an institution with no fund to pay them. And when the prize did not materialize, the shortfall came out of them. And the habit outlasted the reign by 2 centuries. Prize money remained part of how the Royal Navy paid its people until well into the 19th century, divided by a published scale from the admiral down to the ordinary seaman, and it stayed there because it worked the same way it had in 1588. It is remuneration. The Treasury does not have to find. A sailor's real hope of money was always the enemy's cargo rather than his own government's ledger. The Armada was defeated in 1588. The wages were still being argued over long afterwards, and Howard was still out of pocket. That is not a footnote to the victory. On the accounts of the Elizabethan state, it is the mechanism by which the victory was affordable at all.